Consider supporting Archaeosoup on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Link available in the video description. Thank you.
And in the post, we got this package that had it was a package in which there was an envelope, in which there was a letter that had been, as far as I can tell, smeared in human feces. And this letter, I was like, who would send me this? So I opened it up with like tweezers, like, hello, and welcome back to actually something completely different. Today we're doing a bit of an experiment. I'm joined by the marvellous Neil Ackerman. Good afternoon, Neil.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Neil, you may recall, is of the 90s Stone Circle fame. The only recipient of the Muppet of the Month award with a smile on his face, it has to be said. And crucially, the perfect person to talk to about pseudo-archaeology. This whole experiment that we're calling Pseudo-Soup is an opportunity to tackle some of those sometimes alarmingly popular ideas that float into the popular consciousness with regards to our shared humanity and our history. Now, Neil, can you just lay out just very quickly for the boys and girls at home if they can't remember what I'm talking about when it comes to the 90s Stone Circle?
Yes, that was 2019, I think, beginning of 2019, end of 2018. In my previous job as an archaeologist with Aberdeenshire Council, there was a stone circle reported to me. It looked quite interesting. Got Adam Welfare from Hess to come and have a look at it as well, because he's an expert on the stone circles of that area. And we got very excited and put out a press release saying, we've got this newly recorded Bronze Age stone circle. And then a few weeks later, the farmer who had lived there, several farmers before in the 90s, got in touch and said he built it in the 90s. And then we had to put out another press release.
Exactly, yeah. And the only reason why I ask you to mention that is not to bring up your shame once more, but rather to point out that actually some of the ideas that we're talking about today are pitfalls and perils that archaeologists have to be careful to avoid themselves all the time. And I remember at that time your openness and honesty about this case study was actually a bit of an inspiration. It was really lovely to see an archaeologist talking about what it's like to wrestle with simple questions like, what is this? How old is this? Where did this come from? And today's case study has its roots certainly in my life back in 2013 when someone sent me a question of doom with regards to the notion of pyramids in Bosnia. The question is, are there pyramids in Europe? Mr. Soup, help me. Tell me. This guy was very excited. You could almost feel the bright-eyed smile and excitement coming off the email that they sent to me. And my answer, unfortunately, had to be very careful, but also very truthful. And essentially, I said, look, if there were pyramids in Bosnia, pyramids in Europe of this size and scale and scope, first of all, it would be very exciting. You're absolutely right. It would be supremely exciting. But also, we have to be honest and open about this and say that actually, unfortunately, they're not. In this case, what we're looking at are some pyramid-shaped hills, and that actually that whole episode led to me getting some poop in the post, and some other things happened as well, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But essentially, the pseudo-archaeological case study that we're examining today, folks, is of this question of, are there pyramids in Bosnia? It's a question that I first came across, I say, in 2013. It's been floating around since 2005-ish, I think, thereabouts. And one of the main sources that I'll be reading from and quoting today is the Smithsonian Magazine article from 2009. which outlines, well, first of all, the archaeologist involved, well, the self-proclaimed archaeologist involved, Sam Osmanagic, um, who became a bit of a national hero in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as someone who was bringing unknown truths to the surface, someone who was um, fueling national pride after a time of tumult and war in the region, and as someone who even actually ended up getting government backing in the notion, promoting the notion of there being pyramids in Bosnia. Now, is this something that you'd heard of before we came to talk about this today?
Kind of. I was aware of it. I think Ramesh Ranganathan did a travel series,
Mm,
and he went there.
mm,
Um, I think that's pretty much my main interaction with the site was his series of getting a tour by the main guy and looking more and more concerned as he took him into deeper and deeper tunnels and
yeah, yeah.
then wanting to run away basically.
And and it is a
But
little bit,
yeah, that's kind of my
yeah, well, it is a little bit strange. It does seem to be a site that's hoovered up an awful lot of tourism, and has generated quite a lot of, yeah, a little bit of an economy around actually the site. Um, the hills that we're talking about are close to the town of Visco or Visoko, that lies at the southern end of a valley that runs from Sarajevo to Zenica. And the valley has been quarried for centuries, and its geological history is well understood. But despite this, there were claims of pyramids, and the issue here is that, um, in this case, this is something that we're probably going to be identifying quite often in when it comes to pseudo-archaeological stuff. Is that he's putting the hypothetical cart before the horse. These hills look like, or these mountains look like, pyramids, and therefore he's looking for evidence that they are in fact pyramids, as opposed to investigating what are they, and then coming to conclusions as to what their true nature is, which of course, um, is a trap that if we're not careful we can all possibly fall into. Now, the pyramids themselves actually. I have a little diagram here I can just put up on screen, and I sent you an image of this, Neil. It's called Pyramids Found in Europe. This is taken from BosnianPyramid.com. And what they claim is that there are three primary pyramids. There's the Pyramid of the Sun, which is the highest, Pyramid of the Moon, which is the one that Osmanagic seems to be most interested in. He often would take people there on tours. And then there's the Pyramid of the Earth. There's also the Pyramid of the Dragon, which is sometimes talked about, although that's not necessarily easily defined as far as I can tell. It's simply mentioned, and all of this you may recognize is directly referencing pyramids that we see in Mesoamerica. Very much sort of Aztec and Mayan and all this sort of stuff became a fascination for Osmanagic when he was working in Texas. His background actually as an academic was initially international economics and politics at the University of Sarajevo, and years later he obtained a doctorate in sociology of history, and then left Bosnia before its civil war in the 90s, emigrating to Houston, partly for its warm climate, where he started a successful metalworking business that he still owns to this day. And while he was there, he became interested in Mesoamerican archaeology and ruins. And another weird claim is that these pyramids are around 12,000 years old. Now, at this point, it would have been possibly quite chilly in the area. Some people have suggested that it may well have been remnants of ice sheets still floating around as late as 12,000. But yeah, that's okay. You know, we can posit and suggest all sorts of things as to how people might have lived in the area. But we need to bear in mind that this would be a full 8,000 or 7,500 years before the Great Pyramids at Giza were being built. So further away from the pyramids on the Giza Plateau in time than we are from the pyramids on the Giza Plateau ourselves. Which again starts to build up a big question, and this is where I guess we have to then we sort of start to see elements of mysticism and weirdness coming in. I mean, you were saying that you'd listened to a radio show interview um, about energies from space, was it?
Well, it was about an hour and a half long, and I
Mm.
didn't really have the patience to listen to the whole thing, but I was skipping through it.
No.
Yeah, it was covering the kind of the vibrations of people, and it was very kind of conspiracy theory discussion about pyramids of power with
Mm.
extraterrestrial forces controlling the tip of the pyramid,
Mm.
um, and then went on a kind of journey about how COVID is a man-made false thing that
Oh,
the powers are using to keep us locked up. And things like
okay.
that.
So it was as recent as in the past 12 months, then, this interview.
Yeah, it was
Right.
just can't have been a few months ago. Yeah,
Curious. Well, the claims that I've come across on a couple of articles range from the Illyrians built the pyramid. They lived there between 12,000 and 500 BC, supposedly. Geological tunnels underneath the site, which it sounds like Rangan Romanesh um, went on his little TV tour with.
yeah.
These geological tunnels are in fact a man-made network. That's another claim. Standing waves. Standing waves at the top of the largest of the hills, waves which he asserts travel faster than light and prove the existence of a cosmic internet that allow for intergalactic communication. Is one of the functions of these monuments. He also promotes the idea of ancient astronauts and claims that human beings are the product of genetic engineering. Um,
The light wave things.
hmm.
Did you not get that from Tesla? Was it from Tesla's ideas?
Oh, that's another one. So yes, yeah. Ancient pyramid discovery, according to the Express in 2017, is the key to Nikola Tesla's communication with aliens, says expert. Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
yeah. Osmanagic has given his own names to the hills. He has named two of the largest as the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon, not to be confused with the genuine pyramids of the Sun and Moon in Mexico. And other hills have been named by Osmanagic as the Pyramids of Love, Earth, and the Dragon. So, hmm. But what I suppose, but the key question here is, what would happen if you or I were to make these claims about a hill here in Britain? Like what would happen if you just pointed to a hill in Scotland and said that's a pyramid?
I mean, you'd generally kind of get laughed out of town. There probably would be two or three people who would be interested.
Uh-huh.
Um, but one of the things that I find really interesting about this guy is just the kind of the dogged determination
Mm,
to just keep at it.
yeah, yeah.
Like there would have been like if with the stone circle, if I just refused to acknowledge that this farmer had built it and then carried out decades of field work to try and prove that it was what I'd originally said it was. Which,
That would be interesting to
yeah, I don't.
see. Just think, in an alternate universe somewhere, there is a Neil who is still in the field, safe
Yeah,
from COVID, because no
spirit
one's coming
broken,
anywhere near him.
desperately trying to. Yeah,
Well, the thing is, I mean, arguably one of the reasons may well be linked with economics. Um, the belief that Visoko was a cradle of human civilization and that the Bosniaks and their Bosniaks ancestors were master builders who surpassed even ancient Egyptians, has become a matter of ethnic pride. The pyramids have been turned into a place of Bosniak identification, says historian Dubravko Lovrenovic of the Bosnia and Herzegovina Commission to Preserve National Monuments. In and around the site, eateries serve meals on pyramid-shaped plates. Coffee comes with pyramid-emblazoned sugar packets. Foreigners, by the thousands, have come to see what all the fuss is about, drawn by reports by the BBC, Associated Press, Agence France Presse, and ABC's Nightline, which report that thermal imaging had supposedly revealed the presence of man-made concrete blocks beneath the valley, and that's something which actually is mentioned in the. I'll just bring it back up on screen for a second. Mentioned um, in this image is that thermal satellite images show hills cool off more quickly than others in the area, pyramid material absorbs less heat than soil. Hills, the, the, and the hills contain hollow areas, supposedly. Um, it's jumping to conclusions, but you know what he would, no, say what you would be lacking if you were still in that field digging up your stone circle. Well, then that would be government support. This is where it gets really quite interesting. I've actually done. I've done. I used to do back when we were able to do this sort of stuff. I used to do lectures in front of people in the same room as people, and sometimes,
Wow.
sometimes these lectures would be about, for example, pseudo-archaeology, and this is sort of quite high up on my traffic light system of alarming pseudo-archaeological implications is the notion of government support. The Pyramid of the Sun Foundation in Sarajevo was set up by Osmanagic. And actually there's a website. I sent you a link through, incidentally as well, folks. Links to all this are below. Um, there's a website still set up. There's a paper submitted to academia.edu which outlines that the 2013 season, I suppose. It's a very
Yeah.
detailed document, considering what other people have supposedly found, and we'll come back to that in a second. But crucially, Bosnian officials, including the Prime Minister, two presidents, and others, have embraced them, along with the Sarajevo-based news and media companies. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary Bosnians draw on the promise of a glorious past and more prosperous future for their battered country. And skeptics who say the pyramid claims are examples of pseudo-archaeology, pressed into the service of nationalism, have been shouted down and called anti-Bosnian. I'll just say that again, because actually that is quite a strange sentence. Skeptics who say the pyramid claims are examples of pseudo-archaeology pressed into the service of nationalism have been shouted down and called anti-Bosnian. It's twisting. Even twisting the very definition, for example, of what pseudo-archaeology and nationalism linked with these ideas are. And in that sense, the Pyramid Foundation's political clout appears to be considerable, says the author of the Smithsonian piece. When the Minister of Culture of the Bosniak Croat Federation blocked the renewal of foundation permits in 2007 on the grounds that the credibility of those working on the project was unreliable, the action was overruled by the then Federation Prime Minister, who said, "Why should we disown something that the entire world is interested in?" It's difficult, isn't it? And then this is where it starts to become quite sticky, actually. Not just because I received poo in the post. But
Yes.
but because the thing is, you would not, for example, have Nicola Sturgeon's backing to keep on at this, and presumably,
No.
no,
No.
no. So why do you think then that this is more than that there's something desperate here. There's something, and I mean that in a heartfelt sense. I don't mean that in a jokey sense or in a tragic sense. Although it is a little bit tragic, but there's something desperate here for people to wanting something special to be in their back garden, and for it to be more than their recent history. And we'll
Yeah.
come to this notion of trauma in a second. But I mean, can you imagine if? Well, actually, here's an interesting one. Actually, if Scotland does, for example, break away from the United Kingdom, not to take us down
Yeah.
like a serious pathway, but if it did, how tempting would it be to rewrite and to reimagine the narratives linked with some of Scotland's national monuments? Do you think?
I mean, it already happens. The kind of, I mean, Hadrian's Wall being the kind of the obvious site. There's a
Incidentally, I'm living
front
on
cover of
Hadrian's
the.
Wall, and I'm currently 121 miles away from Edinburgh. But anyway,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
It's and there's this idea of using that to other Scotland from the rest of the UK
Mm, mm,
because the Romans stopped, and there is this kind of notion that Scotland was too difficult to defeat, and all this kind of stuff, which is obviously Hadrian got pulled back to Rome because he was getting way too powerful, and things like that. It's different, and yeah, I've seen quite a lot of nationalist arguments and unionist arguments based on the archaeology of Scotland.
Yeah, and
so it is already quite entangled, that whole debate, with mainly prehistoric monuments, which is quite a...
Well, and also in that sense, the very notion that any of those people would recognise the idea of a nation, the notion of a nation, to quote a certain musical. It's interesting that is often where archaeology ends up being used. I mean, we're seeing it being thankfully repudiated at the moment in the US. With the Project 1776 that was about to come out from, well, had been published, I think, by Trump's White House, where the whole goal of history was, on the one hand, to be full of free and open inquiry, but presumably that inquiry had no limits or had no repercussions in terms of public discussion. You're not allowed to question that inquiry, such that inquiry led to national heroes that everyone could agree on, or certainly a certain type of person could agree on. And obviously, the English aren't immune from this by any means. And also back in Wales, I mean, the things like there are big questions as to why it is that, for example, in Wales people came to fixate on figures like King Arthur, when you could make the claim that King Arthur is more of a French hero than a Welsh hero, or but then again, if you ask people down in the Salisbury Plain, they'll point to ideas of King Arthur and this kind of thing. So yeah, okay. So these are complicated things that are tied up with it. But in early 2006, Osmanagic asked a team of geologists from nearby University of Tuzla to analyze core samples at the site, and they found that his pyramid was comprised of the same matter as other mountains in the area, alternating layers of conglomerate clay and sandstone. Nonetheless, Osmanagic put scores of labourers to work digging on the hills, and it was just as geologists had predicted. The excavations revealed layers of fractured conglomerate, while those at other places cracked into sandstone plates on the mountain. They were still nonetheless layers of silt and clay. What he's found isn't unusual or spectacular from a geological perspective, says geologist Robert Salk of Boston University, who spent 10 days at the site in the summer of 2006. It's completely straightforward and mundane. These are called flatirons. They are a geological formation that's common across the world and found, for example, in the southern United States. And this is where I felt quite bad when I was answering this poor guy's question, and he was like, "Oh, they're pyramids!" And I was like, "No, I'm sorry. They're called flatirons. It's a geological formation. They're not pyramids." I did feel bad. I felt as though I was taking something possibly away from this very open and honest inquiry. And in that sense, where do you think the line should be then for archaeologists when it comes to discussing this sort of stuff? Because often, for example, in say certain Scottish narratives, certain Welsh narratives, certain other world views are often tied to things that everyone just kind of either takes for granted or wants to believe. So how can we bring people with us in such a way that we're not destroying their worldview, or don't seem to be wanting to do that, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a really extreme example of that kind of misinterpretation. And I think you have to be honest and say, no, you're wrong. But there's a way, doing it in an incredibly kind of condescending, mocking tone isn't going to help anyone, because it's something that you've believed in. And if someone says, "Oh, you're daft for believing in that," it almost makes someone a double down. So I think it's more about kind of going, okay, that's not, but here's a whole lot of other cool stuff in their area, explore things about that, and then, discuss, I guess, why that interpretation has happened. I think it needs to be more of a conversation rather than just a slamming down. And obviously, we're not, and we're not Bosnian, so to a certain extent, white men like us have gone over the world and told people that they're wrong about the places that they live in. We've got a good history of doing that. Rightfully, I think people are a bit skeptical when someone does that. So yeah, I think just kind of plonking yourself down into a kind of a situation on the ground and telling everyone they're wrong without listening to their ideas and concerns or whatever is not the way to kind of go about it.
That's an interesting one, actually. I remember a few years ago there was the notion that the people in and around Mesoamerican sites should be allowed to have have museums or have even really explicitly commercial enterprises whose job is mainly to raise money to look after these sites, but also to build up a narrative that's about local pride. And the reaction from certainly American anthropologists was one of slight horror, in so much as they didn't think that people, to a certain extent, could be trusted to provide the truth to people who were coming by, as opposed to their truth. And I think what I'm finding interesting about this moment here is that we seem to be leaning towards the idea that should people be allowed to propagate what is obviously nonsense or not? That's a curious one. And just while we think about that, I'll just come to this section in my notes on trauma. There's a quote here from Andres Radelmeyer, a Balkan specialist at Harvard University. I think the pyramids are symptomatic of a traumatized society that is still trying to recover from a truly horrendous experience. You have many people desperate for self-affirmation and, crucially, in need of money. And this idea of there being, I think, tea towels. I'll come to this reason why I know about tea towels in a moment. Tea towels was one of the things that seemingly became a tourist memento that people could take away from visits. But also as well, at the same time, this notion of there being sympathy for this need to tell a story. Local scientists and archaeologists say that the project is not only sullies Bosnian science, but also soaks up scarce resources if the government is actively supporting a site. And incidentally, it appears to, I can't confirm whether this is actually official, but certainly on Google, it appears to have a national park, Pyramid of the Sun National Park in Bosnia. So it's definitely soaking up resources that could otherwise go towards more legitimate historical and archaeological investigation. Critics also cite potential damage to Bosnia's archaeological heritage. Presently, the fossils and artifacts that are recovered across the country are being ignored and destroyed during excavations, inverted commas, as crews work to shape natural hills into crude semblances of Mayan-style step pyramids, which Osmanagic has made people so enamored with. So people are actively forming now their narrative and forming their landscape to reflect this story. Now, I'm going to throw a third thing into the mix here as well, and that is that not kind of what happened, on this island in the Bronze Age? You had people interacting with previous monuments in a way that was clear, as far as we can tell, clearly not direct. It wasn't based on direct knowledge. It was based on a reaction to landscape. Are we not seeing possibly just a modern version of what we recognise as being a legitimate cultural expression in the Bronze Age?
Yeah, I think
it's a difficult one.
Talking about, I was thinking if we were separated from this whole event by a couple of thousand years, it would be incredibly interesting in its own right as a kind of cultural phenomenon and essentially the creation of an archaeological landscape where it didn't exist.
Mm.
So just from a kind of purely looking at cultures and societies and stuff, it's a really interesting case study for all sorts of things.
Mm.
But then there's also people living in that case study and the way that they're being affected, and as you're saying, there's other things that money kind of needs to be spent on that isn't being spent on in favor of this. And then also, if you're someone local to the area, tourists are flocking in, whether you believe it or not. Why wouldn't you cash in on it?
Mm.
You could be kind of silly not to. If you're needing money, I'm assuming tea towels aren't particularly expensive to produce.
Mm.
And if you've got a guaranteed influx of tourists every year, then
they're going to get sold. Yeah.
So you can kind of see why we do that.
Yeah, and as you say, 2,000 years hence, it would be seen as a cultural change, a shift in the landscape, and possibly one that was hinting at an early expression of international identity via what some posit to be electronic internet or something. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, just because it would now actually be reflecting what we currently know to be ancient aliens nonsense would actually be becoming something which is actually a transcontinental reality, because people are aware of what's in Mesoamerica and they're able to reflect it if they want to in Bosnia. Yeah, that is interesting. In
I
2006,
do wonder as well with
sorry, go on. Yep.
So with the kind of Mesoamerican connection, if there wasn't so many decades of pseudo-archaeology on that area, when this guy goes over and works in Texas and gets interested in that, if all that pseudo-archaeology wasn't there, he wouldn't have taken that back to Bosnia with him.
No, I think
potentially,
yeah, I think one of his ideas is that actually in 2012 the world did kind of shift into a new reality, because there's this thing about the Aztec or some people were calling it the Mayan Apocalypse, aren't they? And that the world would end, but he suggested that actually the world shifted into a new phase, moving beyond the horrors of the 20th century, and obviously people like Adolf Hitler he references, are moving in towards something else. But as you say, if there hadn't been that previous interest, then would he have fixated on it? Would it or not? And there are similarities that undoubtedly we may well touch on at some point in the future, in terms of, for example, Stonehenge. Everywhere is Stonehenge of something because so many people know about Stonehenge. But it's definitely a psychodrama of sorts, isn't it? National and local and individual. In 2006, the European Association of Archaeologists wrote an open letter to the Bosnian government denouncing the pyramids as a cruel hoax on an unsuspecting public. They had to write to the government to say that. So again, this has got governmental support and I would say collusion. Indeed. I have colleagues who've gone into silence because the attacks are constant and very terrible, says University of Sarajevo historian Salmedin Mezivahovic. Every day you feel the pressure, they say. Anyone who puts their head above the parapet suffers the same fate, says Anthony Harding, a pyramid skeptic who was, until recently, president of the EAA. Sitting in his office at the University of Exeter in England, he reads from a thick folder of letters denouncing him as a fool, a friend of the Serbs, and a general, despicable person. I won't say what. I've got other notes from what else he said elsewhere. He's labelled his file Bosnia abuse. And this is where my tale comes into this, and that is that in 2013, when I got this letter, I did an open and honest response. I responded to the chap, and like I say, I laid it out. And first of all, I was very clear. Archaeologists would be excited about this if it was true. We would definitely go woohoo! Look at this if it was real. But number two, it is not true. And therefore we cannot, we don't want to mislead you. And very quickly, I started to get some comments, just random comments saying, "You don't know what you're talking about," and of course, being from this island, people were accusing me of being an English so and so, and I was like, "Oh, okay, well, call me a pig dog if you must, but do not call me English." No, so yeah, they were accusing me of all sorts. fairly nasty comments, which became more and more harsher and harsher, until eventually, actually, we received in the post. Thankfully, Mrs. Soup was out; she was working that day. Well, I was working as well. I was working from home. And in the post, we got this package that had it was a package in which there was an envelope, in which there was a letter that had been, as far as I can tell, smeared in human feces. And this letter, I was like, I was like, who would send me this? So I opened it up with like tweezers, like, and in it there was my brother. No, obviously he would never. I opened it up, and inside, there was fairly serious threats. At the time, I was much less guarded about how I referred to Mrs. Soup in public, and also our surname isn't particularly difficult to track down. I believe it's unique, in fact, because we mashed our surnames together when we got married. So. They identified who she was, where she worked. They made a threat against her physical safety. Indeed, they threatened to, as it were, violate her as well on the way back to her car. And at the time, this very much upset her. I mean, well, of course it did. Of course it would. But to the extent that she changed where she was parking to be closer to the office, we got the police involved. But obviously, when I wasn't thinking straight, so when I got this letter coming in shite, I got rid of it. I went, oh, I basically ended up. It was in a public bin that was emptied that day, because I didn't want the smell in the house, and then it was gone. And so, not only was there was nothing that they could pursue in terms of a postmark, for example, on the package. I didn't think to keep the package.
Yeah.
Again, just the shock of it. But also as well, because it was an international postage threat, there wasn't really anything that they could do. They couldn't go around to someone's house and say, "Oi," you know. But in that letter, they did mention the fact that that I was I didn't know what I was talking about. That I was risking, for example, the sales of tea towels and all this kind of thing. My business. Who are you to threaten my business? This kind of malarkey. And so I can relate to what Anthony Harding says when he's keeping a folder of Bosnia abuse. In so much as clearly it's a very important notion to so many people, and I guess this is where this particular video, and in fact this if we do more of these, because actually we put out a call on the internet for Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, etc., for additions to our list of pseudo-archaeological things to look at, which was a very good response, incidentally. Thank you for all the suggestions. This is something that which maybe those people, and in fact I don't think I was necessarily thinking would be the case with for example, our first one, is that it's actually not just funny, it's actually really quite serious. And so I suppose for my part, I guess what I would say to people who may well feel that I'm a threat to their livelihoods is that you're more than welcome to continue with this narrative, as it were. It's more just a case of how we form ideas about the past, and we can't expect archaeologists to take things simply on faith. Just because Osmanagic calls something the Pyramid of the Sun, there needs to be evidence of that. If he's talking about vibrations coming from galactic sources, there needs to be evidence of that. We do thankfully still live in an evidence-based academic community, and so I suppose what I would say, what else could we do if not examine this and take it for what it is? That said, though, it's also a beautiful landscape. Undoubtedly, these flatirons are absolutely gorgeous and dramatic. So there's something to be proud of there. They're just not pyramids, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I mean, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean.
Sorry. Also, please don't send me poo in the post. Thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
In terms of the kind of merchandise stuff, I would imagine any advertising is good advertising. Like, now we've kind of looked into the site, I kind of wouldn't mind a wee detail of it. Like, it's just such an interesting thing,
Yeah, I'd have a mug.
I don't see why that would be an issue particularly. But yeah, in terms of the kind of the academic community in Bosnia, it must be terrifying
Mm,
if you're wanting to do anything else, even if you're not kind of overtly criticizing it, just trying to get money to do other stuff
mm,
must be difficult.
mm,
And yeah, when you have such a kind of when you have government involvement in it to that extent, you're not only going against a very powerful person, you're going against the government and you're being anti-patriotic and all this kind of stuff as well.
mm,
So
mm.
I,
Yeah.
I can't imagine the damage it's done to that kind of academic community.
Mm, mm.
It must be very difficult for them.
Yeah. On that cheery note, I suppose what I would say is that I'm glad that we're fine. Well, I'm glad that I'm certainly glad to have returned to this topic in so much as that's the only video I've ever taken off this YouTube
Mm.
channel. Actually, has been the one about the pyramids. Again, just for my wife's safety. So I'm glad to have returned to it, and I'm also glad that to be actually starting to tackle some of these pseudo-archaeological ideas in a way which hopefully is worthwhile doing. Because I don't want to just be mocking, although some of it is quite fun
Mm.
and sometimes quite funny.
Yeah,
Um, and also, though, I don't want to be allowing these ideas to be, I want to be explicit about the fact that you can't sort of say take um, good archaeology and then just mix it with alien stuff and have a narrative that, for example, most archaeologists will be okay with. I think it's important for archaeologists to be saying, actually, no, we're all for you having fun with the past and doing interpretation, and here's the evidence that we found, and this is the sandbox that you get to play within, you know. Um, but actually, there are limits, and I think I'm glad to be finally starting to address some of these pseudo-archaeological limits. I mean, obviously, you know, Ancient Aliens is one of these, the Yvonne Danikins of this world, and Chariots of the Gods is an infamous one, and there are so many more. And if people like these conversations, I'm more than happy to return to them.
I think as well with one of the things that kind of you have pseudo archaeology like this
Hmm.
example, which has a kind of like he knows what he's doing.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and you have other archaeological theories where someone genuinely has an idea that they believe in
Hmm.
and are pursuing it to try and figure out if it's real or not, and sometimes will kind of turn their back on an academic community to do that.
Or on evidence
But I
that
have
goes
more
against
time
that
for
idea
someone.
as well.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I have more time for someone who's kind of trying to do that. Whereas this guy, like in that video that I was watching
Hmm.
earlier that we mentioned, they were talking about how humans are poisoned by chlorine in the water and everyone's got too much heavy metals in their
Hmm.
system. And yet he is still the owner and CEO of a company that does metal fabricating.
Hmm. Hmm.
So he doesn't believe what he's saying.
No. No.
If he did, he wouldn't be having that. If he was so terrified of heavy metals, he wouldn't have that company.
Hmm. I suppose something I would add to that is that ironically enough, these sorts of projects tend to include an awful lot of mission creep. So that they'll have an idea, there'll be a hypothesis that they're seeking to prove as opposed to disprove, which is what good scientific method is. They're seeking to prove their idea, and then people start to staple on other ideas to it. So things like intergalactic vibrations, things like heavy metal poisons, things like certain forms of spirituality, and before you know it, you have this monstrous, indefinable thing that actually kind of can't even really easily be picked apart to be disproved or disproven. Uh, which then, presumably by the look of it, he's still riding the crest of the wave of, because this thing is essentially thrives on never answering questions. And I think, and this is ultimately, I guess, this is the theme that I always will be returning to in these sorts of conversations, is that you need to look out for whether or not the person who's giving you, who's positing certain ideas, is actually seeking to answer the question, or seeking simply to get you interested in the question, and then keep on asking another question and another question and another question, to the point that you're completely off the farm. You're nowhere near anything that could be considered to be a provable concept. That's the hallmark of pseudo-archaeology, is a sequence of never fully answered questions
Yeah.
that make an awful lot of money when you publish them in very accessible media. Yeah. So
I think as well with that 2013 report, where it's kind of trying to make it more like a kind of
yeah.
a formal archaeology report.
Mm,
And one of the things that really struck me in that is all the volunteers being taught how to do archaeology.
yeah.
And, it said that it had something like over 400 volunteers.
Mm,
And you've got, all these images of mainly kind of young, enthusiastic
mm,
kind of people wanting to get into archaeology
mm,
and being shown how to excavate
mm,
and record stuff. It's just, they're being trained with falseness.
yeah.
Not to mention some of the trenches they had were incredibly deep, and there's some poor young kid at the bottom of it wearing no protection whatsoever, and if that thing falls,
Yeah.
they're done for.
Mm. So yeah, so basic
It
safety steps like
impacts a lot.
stepping the trench, this kind of thing, aren't necessarily being done.
Yeah.
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 Also, actually, a related issue as well is that in that 2013 season, that I got a screen capture for, but I haven't got it to show live now, so I'll put it in the edit. Screen capture for, which I can no longer find. In that blog that I remember looking at the time, there was reference to certain academics here in Britain. I think some notable archaeologists in English universities, who it was claimed had visited the site and had given it the thumbs up, but they hadn't. So again, it's that fraudulent. That's the really damaging aspect here. Um, and so much as and again, I suppose I would also just reiterate that again, we're all free to tell stories, but when, yeah, when you're actively being fraudulent in your activity and your claims, then you've surely to goodness got to raise some eyebrows. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, not. I think this has been a good first episode. I think we've examined an idea that
Yeah.
I guess you weren't fully aware of until I brought it to your attention. What if we do another one? What is the archaeological site or archaeological idea that you would like to bring to my attention then?
Well, I would quite like to look at Skara Brae, the Neolithic settlement on Orkney. That is what I'm doing my PhD around, that kind of area and building type. But it's a site that has been in the public knowledge for over 100 years and has picked up a lot of kind of alternative theories. Some kind of going to the point of almost being willfully fraudulent, and then others where it's just someone who's come in generally from a different background and put another kind of spin on it that isn't true, but it's not someone trying to defraud a nation.
So that sounds
so
very much
it's,
like
it's
the
a
sort of
nice
thing that happens at Stonehenge, where you'll have engineers saying clearly this was the case when they don't know about the context of what they're looking at. Yeah. But anyway, so go on.
Yeah. So it's just I think that there's various different things to kind of look at. There isn't such a kind of a massive case study as what we've studied here, but I think looking at how professional archaeologists have interpreted it and non-archaeologists have interpreted it, there's some interesting kind of things to play with there, I think.
Okay, I'll look forward to it. Skara Brae didn't, off the top of my head, didn't they have flushing toilets? Supposedly.
They have kind of a sewage system type thing running underneath it that would rival a medieval town. Like it's a big kind of system, and there's alcoves that connect to it.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So
I
I
like
think
it. Yep.
you kind of
Kind of.
into the trench.
Yeah. Okay, cool, cool. I look forward to hearing about that. If folks at home, if you have any ideas or suggestions as to sites or ideas, pseudo-archaeological theories that we could examine, or that could be examined in this series, please do comment below. I say we've got wonderful comments on the posts elsewhere. I'll make a document of those and keep those in mind for future. But I suppose all that remains to say is thank you for watching, and until next time, do take care. Bye bye.
Bye, everyone.